Let me see here. Okay. Yeah, like what happened with St. Maximus. No, it's fine. That's why I figured that's what you were kind of asking. And that makes sense. But yeah, this happened even in cases, like as I mentioned, in the case of Nestorius, that one has been used. You know what? That gives me an idea. Let me see here, because what I'd like to do, and let me see if it's, I'm just going to check to see how long this is. Hold on. I'm going to quickly take a look here. True Orthodox. All right, so I've got a subject here that I can do. This is a 20-minute video, because people have asked me about this video, which we've answered. We answered in a really long kind of, our typical 2 to 3 hour way. But people want to see if we can address the questions that were asked in this original video here. So I am going to just put it on the screen, and we're gonna do a live kind of a review of the video, just for the heck of it, and then I can chop it out and I can make it a clip. Give me a moment, and so let me see if I can just get that on the screen. And okay, so I'm gonna pause it when I feel like there's stuff that needs to be discussed, and so let's go.
Greetings, everyone. David the Real Midwife here, and 2 days ago I had a poll on Twitter where I asked my followers what they wanted to see next, what they wanted me to cover, and there are like 4 options, and half of them wanted me to cover the true Orthodox problem, and so here we are. And this so-called true Orthodoxy is no doubt a prevalent issue in our church, especially because of the new wave of catechumens and people inquiring to the Orthodox faith. Many of these people that come to the faith come here because of its ancient roots, and they don't really know it fully. And so when they hear the polemics of the so-called true Orthodox, some of them end up being seduced, and then they end up departing from the true faith.
I'm going to stop right there because I do want to enter this. The polemics he's talking about are literally cataloging ecumenical, Sergionistic abuses, modernist abuses, the stuff that people actually didn't want and why they came to Orthodoxy to begin with. Sergionism, modernism, ecumenism. This is the stuff that we're trying to run away from in coming to Orthodoxy. But that's our polemic. That's our big attack on world Orthodoxy, is pointing out that they're being hypocrites. So let's continue.
And so this video is going to cover the objections of the so-called true Orthodox, debunk the erroneous claims that go contrary to the ancient faith. And so the first thing we need to understand is what even is this so-called true Orthodoxy. Well, they're a collection of uncanonical groups. Some of their groups include genuine Orthodox Church. Some of them call themselves old calendarists. And just to clarify for some people that don't know the calendar issue, when I say old calendarist, I do not mean churches that are in the old calendar. Many old calendar churches are in communion with churches that are in the new calendar, right?
Okay, so here's the first case of slipping in some straight-up deceit. He kind of puts this in as they're a collection of uncanonical groups. Well, we're going to get to that. Such as the Genuine Orthodox Church, that's valid. Old calendarists, that's not actually what we called ourselves. That's what they called us. Old believers, which is a 300-year-old schism, some of which have people who don't even believe in an episcopate anymore, and have nothing to do with us, but you just threw that in there anyway. So we'll continue on, and we'll let him talk a little more.
But old calendarists are those that are in the old calendar, and they reject all new calendar churches and those that are in communion with new calendar churches.
Stopping here. Once again, I need to kind of flash everyone back to the past, because this is where the kind of deception kind of begins. And what I'm referring to is, at that time, there was only the Church of Constantinople, the Church of Finland, and the Church of Greece in 1924, who were on the new calendar. Everyone else was actually on the church calendar. So this idea that like everyone went to the new calendar and the old calendar was protest, that's all a lie. The Serbians were willing to help the genuine Orthodox of Greece. The Russians had their own issues, as you know, and the main issue wasn't Sergianism. The main issue was being murdered. And so the persecutions against the true Orthodox in Greece and in Russia are well known. You all know them, I'm sure. If not, there are videos that we have done referring to them. They're well documented. The idea that the entire church had suddenly become magically new calendar is just a flat out lie, and that's not what happened. So 1920s to 1930s, most people actually supported the true Orthodox, not the innovators.
And there are also groups like the Old Believers that go far back to the 17th century, but most of the true Orthodox that we are concerned with are going to be the modern ones. Some of our objections are going to apply to the Old Believers as well, but this video is going to be focusing.
He doesn't know what we are, so he just lumped us in with Old Believers, but that's fine.
On the more modern so-called true Orthodoxy. And true Orthodoxy, which from now on I will call fake Orthodox from now, in the modern sense start to appear during the...
And then they wonder why if we say something like we don't recognize your sacraments, why they would get mad.
1920s and 1930s, both in Greece and Russia. When the tragic Pan-Orthodox Congress of Constantinople introduced the new calendar, there was an old calendarist movement. At first,
one thing to note, he's actually, even though he calls it a tragic council, it's a council he tragically recognizes.
First, it was legitimate, it wasn't a schism, but then a couple years later, 3 bishops schismed from the church, and then the old calendarist movement really started to begin.
That's not actually true. It actually was 11 years, not a couple of years, during which the state church heavily persecuted those on the traditional calendar, closed down churches, arrested people, killed people. Monks from Mount Athos would come and serve all over the nation, assisting people to use, the traditional form, to use their traditional calendar, etc. So this idea that it was just like a bunch of people who were just like sitting around is a lie. It's a lie. There were mass arrests. There were mass protests. The entire thing is just based. He's reducing it to an academic dispute and threw in the Old Believers for absolutely no reason. But in any case, so we go on.
In Greece. And for Russian churches, especially for those that were abroad, the split happened because of Sergianism. And what Sergianism is when Patriarch Sergius...
He's actually wrong on that too. There were actually true Orthodox before that. They were the ones that were being persecuted by the state heavily. The Living Church was the original Soviet-sponsored church and sent representatives to that tragic council that David tragically recognizes. And they attempted to impose the new calendar, and it failed miserably. The true Orthodox wanted nothing to do with the Living Church. But then we get to Patriarch Sergius after when he was metropolitan. He declared in 1927 that he would be completely subservient to the Soviet state. Which that declaration led to a full-on schism where the Orthodox in Russia, who did not want to be part of what would be eventually termed the Red Church, would separate from communion. And there were varying degrees of this, but they separated in communion before the making of Patriarch Sergius in 1943, but the declaration in 1927.
In 1927 told the Russian Orthodox faithful to submit to the Soviet Union. Many Russian churches abroad said, yeah, this ain't it, and they just left and schismed from the church.
No, they didn't say, yeah, this ain't it. They said they refused to recognize the Soviet power, at which point the Soviet power attempted to use the force of law in places like the United States and in Europe to take away churches abroad. This unfortunately also led to the Evlogian schism. It led to the formation, effectively, of the American Metropolia, which would become the OCA after it kind of bowed the knee to the Moscow Patriarchate in 1970. So yeah, one thing that we have to notice here, and I hate to say it's kind of a deceitful tack, is to misrepresent history for what it is. The heroic lives of the new martyrs were virtually buried by the Soviets until the 2000 Council. So it's something to keep in mind that until 2000, once again, all those new martyrs recognized by Rokor and recognized within Russia among the true Orthodox were not recognized by Moscow.
And so some of them, a lot of them came back to the Russian church. Some of them came back.
He means Moscow.
To Orthodoxy. But there are still some churches that haven't come back. And today, the main issue...
This is also kind of misread. This again implies that we left somewhere. We didn't leave. People began leaving under, funding from different groups like the CIA to switch to the new calendar. What had happened ultimately was a forced form of isolation while modernism and ecumenism were taking hold in the churches that we now refer to as World Orthodoxy, a term that was again invented by Father John Meyendorff in 1971, as Father Cyril from Rosas noted.
Whether it's a Greek old calendars or a Russian schismatic, is ecumenism. They claim that we have various people in high positions, various hierarchs that are ecumenist. And this is the ultimate main point the fake Orthodox would try to drive home.
He's still wrong on that. If you think that the true Orthodox in Russia have forgotten the experience of the Soviet Union, the apostasy of Sergius, or anything else like that, they haven't. So it's still an issue to them, and it's still an issue to the rest of us as well. Unfortunately, I like to, and I say this often, that the COVID pandemic ultimately was a global Sergionism test. And a lot of people failed, and some people did a makeup. And unfortunately, the state proved that, it was proven that a world kind of force to see if the churches would bow down did become real. And we're seeing that live. And I think that was a big threshing floor for a lot of people, and what caused them to look more into true Orthodoxy to begin with.
And the problem here with this polemic is that it's not even wrong. When they say that there's a problem in the Orthodox Church in regards to ecumenism, they're actually 100% correct. There is indeed.
Yeah, I don't think I need to leave a comment, but I really, really want to stress that what he just said, if we can just repeat that, because I want to repeat it, because I'm actually going to note it and timestamp it.
When they say that there's a problem in the Orthodox Church in regards to ecumenism, they're actually 100% correct. There is indeed a problem in the Orthodox Church. But the main issue here is, does it warrant a schism? Does it mean that we should schism from the true church? Does it mean we should set up parallel authorities? This is the main argument that I will go with in this video.
Yeah, well, those parallel authorities had already formed. There's no way around that, and the canons require people to go and follow true bishops. And more importantly, once they have true bishops, they're supposed to stay with those true bishops in the exact same way they were before there was a controversy. So I'm curious to see where he goes down this road. I haven't seen this video in a couple of years, so I guess we're watching it together.
So whether it is implicit or explicit, there's going to be two arguments coming from the fake Orthodox. And the first argument is going to be that breaking certain canons automatically excommunicates you and you lose grace. And the second argument is that we're obligated to sever communion with those that break canons. And
the idea of somebody having no grace comes from the fact that they're committing to heresy. Heretics do not have grace. That is something that is pretty well established in the canonical tradition. Breaking communion with heretics, I think by now we have introduced Canon 15 of the First Second Synod to the world in pretty good fashion, and have introduced people to the rudder, which literally says breaking communion with heretics is obligatory.
And before I move on, it will be good to understand that this is actually very similar to a heresy that happened centuries ago. This is very similar to Donatism.
Wait.
Donatism was very similar.
Donatism? Was it Donatism?
Except it said that clergy that commit sins they have no grace. So if you commit a sin, then you are without grace, or you lose grace.
For those of you who had watched my initial debate with Resident Sleeper on the Crucible channel, you may have noticed that I had this argument twice because people did not know what Donatism was. And one caller actually misrepresented and claimed that that Donatism was about breaking away from heretics, which is absolutely false. When confronted with this, they basically reacted with denial. Unfortunately, the truth is Donatism is about sin. It is not about heresy. We continue.
And as a matter of fact, I will say that Donatists are more consistent, because Donatists don't stop at canons. Just stopping at canons and saying that's where you lose grace is kind of arbitrary, whereas the Donatists take it to its full logical conclusion and say, well, sinning is breaking God's canons, and therefore a clergy should not be sinning at all. He should be perfect.
Okay, well, now we finally know the origin of the caller's ridiculous belief system. Apparently, Mr. Erhan believes that the Donatists were more consistent than following the rules and traditions in the Holy Canons and the rules and traditions of the Church. He believes, if we're going to do this, we may as well start believing in perfect clergy, even though there's no good reason for us to do that, because that's never really been a belief in the Orthodox Church. So in other words, I think what they want is for us to be Donatists, even though they know we are not Donatists, but they don't want to admit that.
And so we will be arguing this. Is it true that you can be automatically excommunicated and lose grace the moment you transgress certain canons?
Not the issue. It's about falling into heresy. People transgress canons and go to confession all the time for them. And then they're confessed and they're forgiven. Accidents happen. Mistakes happen. Laziness happens. However, heresy is none of those things. Heresy is not simply breaking a canon. Heresy is abandoning the faith.
And this is what we're going to tackle. And church history proves that this is not the case and has never been the case. And here are some of the examples. The first example will be Saint Nicodemus, the Hagurite, and in his writings, he states, and I quote, "The canons command the council of living bishops to depose the priests," good so far, "or to excommunicate them, or to anathemize laymen who violate the canons. Yet if the council does not actually effect the deposition of the priests, or the excommunication, or the anathemization of laymen, these priests and laymen are neither actually deposed, nor excommunicated, nor anathemized." And need I remind you that Saint Nicodemus is also is considered a saint also in fake Orthodox churches. And
okay, well, that's his first point. It's wrong, but that's his first point. His assumption here is that if there is no living synod of bishops, then nothing can be done. And he'd be right, except for one problem. There are and were living synods of bishops who were, in fact, excommunicating the New Calendarists in Greece after the New Calendarists excommunicated the true Orthodox. So ultimately, this argument is part of why you have to pretend there's no synods of bishops of true Orthodox. You have to pretend a couple of hundred true Orthodox bishops that are all over the world. They're not there. Because if they are there, and they did the work they're supposed to, which is to say that if you are under the Ecumenist or the Sergius, you're anathematized, the work's done. So this is not a proof. He's just trying to deny, again, that our synods exist.
And another example will be if you go back to the 5th century with the Nestorian crisis. Saint Cyril's third letter to Nestorius, which is dogmatized in Ephesus 1, which contains the 12 anathemas against Nestorianism. And so if the fake Orthodox lies were true, then what Saint Cyril will address Nestorius will be in a complete different vein with how he's addressed. But let's see how Saint Cyril addresses Nestorius. "To the most reverend and God-loving fellow ministers Nestorius, Cyril and Synod assembled in Alexandria of the Egyptian province, greeting in the Lord." So Nestorius, despite being a heretic, is still regarded as a fellow minister, as a colleague. But
this is a false argument in so many ways that it actually hurts my ears. The first problem is that Saint Cyril did not react that way to Nestorius. He was busy telling priests and people who had fled Nestorius's heresy to continue saying prayers at home, to operate churches from home, and to get away from the heretics. David's entire argument relies on a greeting, which, by the way, was an invitation to the council, which was going to depose him. Nestorius did not answer the greeting, assembled kind of private security so he couldn't be taken out, and they anathematized him in absentia, and deposed him. Further, and if we look at the acts of the council, this is what's going to get you. Let me see. I'm gonna try to point that out. So give me just a moment, because this is going to be kind of funny. Because here's what he's saying. He's saying that this did not separate the Nestorians from the council. But now let's go look at what the rudder actually says, because this is going to surprise you. You see, I'm going to try to see if I can get to links here. I'm going to get to the it was convened against Nestorius. Okay, give me just a moment as I go through these. Hold on, give me a moment. I'm going to go through, if you don't mind, real quick. I'm just going to go through the actual canons in question, because we're talking about the Third Ecumenical Council. They greeted Nestorius to invite him in. He refused to show up. But now I'm going to actually show you what the canons of the Third Ecumenical Council say. And that's very, very important. And I'll tell you why. Because if we look, give me just a moment. Okay, window, the rudder, share. Okay, so let me switch this to single page because it makes it easier to read. That definitely not what I wanted to do. Okay, all right, so if we go to here, we look at Canon 1. Canon 1 basically is a warning that anyone who was absent from the synod is liable to excommunication, etc. We go to Canon 2. If any provincial bishops fail to attend or follow Nestorius into apostasy, then they are alienated from their rank and from holy orders. We go to Canon 3. If anyone, clergymen in the city or district, have been removed from their titles by Nestorius and his party on account of their believing rightly, we have adjudged it right and just that they be restored to their own rank. We collectively bid the clergymen who agree in their beliefs with the Orthodox and the Ecumenical Synod not to submit in any way whatever to the bishops who have apostatized or deserted us. This is, by the way, as we go through this, this is actually the legal canonical basis for Canon 15 of the First Second Synod. It is precisely this case. So that's the deceit that is involved here. That's the deception we're dealing with, that they're actually trying to present what was actually a proof of the proper way to behave in Orthodoxy as though it isn't. If any of the clergymen should apostatize and dare, publicly or privately, to hold the beliefs of Nestorius or Celtius, the Holy Synod deemed it just and right that these men too should be deposed. So keep in mind what's happening here. The people who didn't follow Nestorius are being elevated. They're being recognized for their heroic stand against the heresy. And the people who followed the heresy or said, well, I guess it's okay. I guess he's the bishop because he's in the church, like what David's doing here, are condemned. So we go further. As for all those who have been condemned by the Holy Synod or by their own bishops for improper acts, and to whom Nestorius and those sharing his views of rank have sought or should seek to give back communion or rank uncanonically and in accordance with the indifference shown by Nestorius in all matters, we have deemed it right and just to show they remain without benefit and they be left nevertheless deposed. But wait, this is going to get even better, because here's the other thing that's not mentioned. Despite the fact that the Nestorian schism and the letter that David produced, the invitation to the council, and finally the conciliar actions that occurred, All of this occurred in the scope of 2 years. 2 years. No internet, no telephones, no high-speed mail, no express mail. 2 years. That's how long it took. So when people say, oh, well, we have to be patient, we have to wait. It's been 100 years, guys. 100 years. Let's get back to David's little video. We want to see if there's any more here. Yeah, okay, these are more people who ended up, because they sold out, so they ended up getting kicked out. Okay, and then more on the orthodoxy of, on the orthodoxy of Saint Cyril and the Orthodox parties. Give me one moment while I switch to this. And we get back to the video.
Saint Cyril did this very thing, and I will remind you that he did this in the same letter where he gave the 12 chapters against Nestorius. There's also other parts of church history where worse offenders were still considered part of the church.
I want to stop this because this is in particular a very devilish and ecumenist argument that has come up very often, especially among new Orthodox Christians who are not familiar with the history of the church. This is one of the most evil and misleading arguments. This argument is basically but somebody else did something even more evil argument. Many evil things have happened in the history of the church. We're not supposed to use that as our standard. It's not supposed to be how evil we can become, how heretical we can become. But since that's the route David wants to go, let's keep it up.
Simony was a huge problem in the days of Saint Nicodemus. He called Simoniacs the biggest heretics against the Holy Spirit, and yet he still did not schism from the church. And
okay, first off, a Simoniac would be an individual. In many cases, those accusations were not always legitimate. It was a very common accusation, particularly under the Ottoman Empire. If this is his proof for not going to true bishops and sticking with people who recite the Filioque, who, baptize babies that have been purchased for gay marriages, if this is what his thing is, like, it's a church that was under subjection to the Ottomans, and unfortunately there were accusations of purchases of ordinations, which is a great sin. It is heretical, but I can't even compare these. These are willing people willing to destroy the church, not like these people that were suffering under the Ottoman yoke.
Also, the fake Orthodox churches still consider those clergy as part of the succession. There are also 3 Hezekastic councils in the 14th century, and in the Tomos of 1349, it says that if you reject these councils, you are anathema. You shall be anathemized. Yet in Russia, especially during the time of Peter the Great Devil, they banned hesychasm. They banned these practices. They called these practices Greek innovations in Russia.
That's not true. The Hezekast tradition was alive in Russia. St. Nicholas of Sora was one of its greatest representatives. He's trying to condemn the church under Peter the Great, even though no real great heresies had occurred. I can't believe this is a real argument, considering that all Orthodox, true Orthodox all over the world, whether in Greece, Russia, etc., we all accept these councils. So what he's really condemning isn't us. He's actually condemning the pre-Soviet, the pre-revolutionary church, which is par for the course if you're supporting Soviets. We continue.
And nothing happened to those that banned it. No one schismed from them. There was no schism from these clergy that banned it.
Well, I mean, there were schismatics. They were called the old believers, the ones you try to link up with us. Unfortunately, his knowledge of Russian history is pretty poor. I really don't appreciate the Peter the Great Devil comment. I think that's even worse than the fake Orthodox. I think we should pray for Orthodox kings, even ones that are failed, that didn't live up to the greatness of their office.
And on the topic of Peter the Great Devil, people talk about Sergianism, but 18th century Russia was proto-Sergianist. It
could not be proto-Sergianist because Russia at the time was officially an Orthodox country, not an atheistic one.
hierarchs, many people in the church, noted that the Tsar, Peter the Great Devil, was the head of the church at that point, that he was the head of the Russian church.
The king is usually the head of the church in a country. He's the legal head. That's how it worked with the emperors, too.
And again, fake Orthodox succession comes from these people, comes from this church as well.
Well, I'm glad that he admits that our succession comes from the Russian and Greek churches as they historically were, as opposed to modernizing heretics.
And you might say, if you're holding to fake Orthodoxy, you might say, well, it doesn't really matter. Okay, those are Sergians. Okay, I don't care about Sergians. For me, ecumenism is the main problem.
This implies that we would say that they're Sergian. That's a lie. He's trying to imply that we would switch arguments up when we wouldn't, because we're not actually afraid of confronting the history of the Russian church, especially whether before or after the Soviet period. Our interlocutor is. And that's, probably why he has to make sure that he tries to get us banned from platforms, because he wants to falsely malign the true Orthodox and the historical Orthodox in Greece and Russia, apparently.
Sorry, but ecumenism is not a new problem.
It kind of is. It's 100 years old. It's a new problem.
It goes far back. We already had ecumenism and this issue in 18th century Russia and Greece. In Russia, many clergy stated that heterodox sacraments were valid. In Mount Athos, which is the center of Orthodox spirituality, the monks allowed Roman Catholics to commune. And then the
history of this can be found in the book Eustathios Argenti by Callistus Ware. Those people were often punished on Mount Athos for doing that. The theology in Russia did depend occasionally on Latin sources and did rely on scholasticism. They also did have a looser form of perception because the forms of baptism, etc., had not changed too much. They were also dealing with the uniate problem, where you had people with virtually identical baptisms as the Orthodox who were suddenly under Rome wanting to come back. He's presenting very, very complicated time periods in the church as though it was just ecumenism. Brush it off. That's evil. And I think that it really needs to stop. But unfortunately, we still have 10 more minutes of this.
Said that the Pope is the supreme pontiff of all the Christian world. And so I will remind you for the third time, fake Orthodox succession comes from these people. Yet these people...
The pre-revolutionary people who didn't actually officially ever say that the Pope was the head of the Christian world. But yeah, we do come from those people.
Their logic should not even be called priests. They shouldn't even be part of the church. They're outside the church because they're heretics. Right? And ultimately...
Keep in mind, he's saying that the pre-revolutionary Russian and Greek churches were heretics. Think that through.
This argument of automatic excommunication and losing grace for breaking canons comes from the heterodox notion that ecclesiastical grace is dependent upon the person holding that position alone. And this...
No, that's actually the Orthodox position. That's why a bishop, when he's consecrated, takes an oath to preserve the Orthodox faith. He's a person. Bishops are people. Their job is to preserve the Orthodox faith. And if they deviate from the Orthodox faith through innovation, then they're heretics.
Causes a massive epistemological issue for the church. If that was truly the case, then you could never be certain that that the bishop that you're under in, that the priest you're under has grace.
It's really a question. We're talking about public proclamations. The problem with David's argument is that he's now going to talk about secret, or it seems he's implying that we're going to have to deal with secret heretics. The church has no issue with secret heretics. They can be discovered and anathematized after death. The issue is public proclamation of heresy. And if you publicly proclaim, that's why the canons say bareheaded in the church, then you are a heretic. This is not some sort of hidden secret game. When you have the ecumenical patriarch saying that the Pope is the first bishop of the church and praying with him in ecumenical doxologies with him listed as the first bishop of the church, he's proclaiming the Pope of Rome is the head of the church. That is a public thing. It's so public, there are loads of YouTube videos about it, and I invite people to look those up.
Will never be 100% certain. And Saint Augustine argued against this with the Donatists, and I will use his argument that he uses against Donatists to the fake Orthodox. And so how would you know for certain that your bishop or priest abide by the canons and or aren't secret heretics? How do you know?
That's not an issue. We already covered it's not an issue because we're not talking about secret heresy. It's good that he's using the argument against the Donatists. It would be nice if he used them against Donatists, but okay.
Know that the priest that baptized you or confirmed you had grace? How can you know for certain? Ultimately,
if his bishop confesses the true faith, we know for certain. If his bishops confess the true faith, we know for certain. If the entire synod confesses the true faith, we know for certain. This is a stupid argument.
It's impossible to know these things. And so the entire...
It's like really not impossible to know these things. These things, they say these things in public. It's like the opposite of impossible. It's very, very possible to know these things.
Your structure crumbles down. And we can see the fruits of St. Augustine's argument in church history by looking at St. Constantine and Eusebius. Eusebius, even after Nicaea, had Arian tendencies. And despite the fact that the possibility of him still retaining heretical Arian beliefs was high, the fake Orthodox still consider St. Constantine's baptism to be legitimate.
It's worth noting that in the actual liturgical text that St. Constantine is baptized by St. Stephen, there have been debates as to who precisely baptized St. Constantine, but there was never a doubt he was Orthodox, so this is a stupid argument.
Otherwise, how could he even be a saint, right? And now that's done, let's consider the second objection, and an objection stating that are we obligated to break communion with those that are heretics or canon breakers? Not all the time. So, for example, during the height of the Arian crisis, there was a time where only 5 bishops were Orthodox. Yeah,
that's not exactly accurate, but we'll go with that. Okay, so only 5 bishops are Orthodox. That would mean the other ones are what? They're heretics.
You can observe that those bishops didn't schism from the church. They were still in communion with the Arians. They didn't leave the church.
That's not true at all. He's just wrong on the history.
With the heretical Arian bishops, and they also remained in communion with each other, who was in communion with the rest of the church. And there's another example of Saint Gregory.
It's worth noting that this was part of the reason why the First Ecumenical Council was called, because of a lot of breaking communion that David is pretending doesn't exist.
Gregory the Elder, who's the father of Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, he signed a semi-Arian creed in 361. He pronounced the semi-Arian creed, and the Orthodox monks excommunicated him for doing this. Yet others and his son, Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, stick with him. And in 364, after Saint Gregory the Elder pronounced the Orthodox confession, Saint Gregory Nazianzus referred to these monks that excommunicated him as hasty, and he advised them that they should not return to their own vomit.
Okay, that's wonderful. St. Gregory the Elder repented, gave an Orthodox confession. His son obviously understood him well enough to know that this was probably all due to a misunderstanding, and this is David's argument for the Ecumenical Patriarchate recognizing Rome, for the recognition of Anglican mysteries on the part of multiple innovating hierarchies, the Assisi meeting, the meetings that they've been having now, the meetings they're planning to have in Nicaea, the constant recognition of heterodox mysteries causing the debate over rebaptism that is happening right now with Father Peter Heers. And this is his evidence. His evidence is in St. Gregory the Elder, a very old monk who made a mistake, repented. We continue.
And let's talk about Saint Cyril once more and with Nestorius. Saint Cyril maintained communion with those that communed with Nestorius, including the Antiochian Christologists, who were fervent defenders of Nestorianism.
I remind you back to the beginning of the video that this entire crisis that led to the Ecumenical Council deposing Nestorius was approximately 2 years, during which many people did break communion with Nestorius, including St. Celestine, but David doesn't want you to know that because he doesn't want you to know the history, because if you know the history, you'll know he's wrong.
And so we can observe from all of these events that maintaining communion with these people at times is the better option.
Even though that's not really what happened, and it's not the better option.
And these aren't the only problems with fake Orthodox. There's various other issues that I want to tackle about the fake Orthodox. And the first one will be about the misinterpretation of the canons. The two favorite canons that they like to use against real Orthodox is Canon 15 of First Second Council, and particularly this part is where they really like to refer. But as for those persons, on the other hand, who on account of some heresy condemned by holy councils or fathers, withdrawing themselves from communion with their president, who, that is to say, is preaching the heresy publicly and teaching it barehead in church, such persons not only are not subject to any canonical penalty on account of their having walled themselves off from any and all communion with the one called a bishop before any consular or synodal verdict has been rendered, but on the contrary, they shall be deemed worthy to enjoy the honor which befits them among Orthodox Christians, for they have defied not bishops, but pseudo-bishops and pseudo-teachers, and they have not sundered the union of the church with any schism, but on the contrary have been sedulous to rescue church from schisms and divisions. The problem is not what this canon says, because this canon is indeed orthodox. The problem is the interpretation. This does not say that we should completely separate from the church that are in communion with those that quote unquote openly preach heresy.
Actually, no one said it's separation from the church. This is the same argument that I heard again with the debate with Resident Sleeper on the Crucible, which unfortunately is this presupposes that the innovating bodies are the church. That's not what happened. And so if we go to Canon 15 of the First Second Synod, it says, we can safely say that David's reading was correct there. However, the interpretation actually says, if we were to read it, give me just a moment, because I'm going to bring it up. If we can just bring this up for just a moment here, because this is apparently, there seems to be a bit of an issue. Well, you don't understand the interpretation of Canon 15. Well, let's find out what the interpretation says, because, apparently we don't understand the interpretation. The interpretation says, and we'll go, this is the first part of it. I'm going to skip to what's relevant. And it says, but these provisions are of effect if priests separate from their bishops, or bishops separate from their metropolitans, or if their metropolitans separate from their patriarchs on account of certain criminal charges of fornication, say, of sacrilege, of other serious crimes. In other words, sins. It's to avoid Donatism. If, however, the said presidents are heretics and preaching their heresy openly, and on this account are subject to them separate themselves, even though it be before there has been a synodal trial concerning this heresy, but are even deemed to deserve fitting honor as Orthodox Christians, since not only have they caused no schism in the church on account of their separation, but they've rather freed the church from schism and the heresy of their pseudo-bishops. See Apostolic Canon 31. Translation: he actually doesn't understand the interpretation, or more likely, because he read it, he doesn't want you to understand the interpretation. Ladica, benedicite.
Benedicite.
I'm glad you're here. I'm basically I know we've dealt with the True Orthodoxy debunked video in a long one, but people have asked for a live debunking of the the wording in the video, and I'm about 8 minutes away from done. So basically, what we were covering here was the claim that, frankly, we don't understand how Canon 15 is to be interpreted, even though the interpretation is on the next page. So let's get back to this video and let's finish it off.
Didn't we do this already?
We didn't do a live one, and it was asked for because we did do a longer show on it. But I think people wanted to see an actual live response, back forth.
You already did? All right. Well, I'll let you take care of it.
Okay. Well, I'm almost done here.
All right.
Okay. So
rather, it's telling you to be like Saint Cyril. Saint Cyril anatomized Nestorianism before the Council of Ephesus. This canon is telling you to be like Saint Cyril. It's not telling you to be like the fake Orthodox that just leave the church altogether.
Just a reminder, in case you want to rewind, this particular council is the very basis for Canon 15, so he's not only wrong, he's misrepresenting the history.
Together. Another canon that should be brought up to attention is the Sajilion of 1583. The Sajilion of 1583 condemns the Gregorian calendar for changing the Paschalion. And while we know that this Sajilion did happen, what we know about this Sajilion today turns out to be forged. It's not even a real Sajilion. So we don't have the full details of this anymore. All we know that it condemned the Paschalion, which the new calendar doesn't even use the new Paschalion.
The new calendar originally did use the new Paschalion. The revised Julian calendar was actually a fix for using the entire revised Julian, which was originally the Gregorian, which is why Finland is completely on the new calendar. And from what I understand, soon Ukraine will be too.
Of the Roman Catholics, it still uses the Orthodox Paschalion. The succession of the fake Orthodox are also inconsistent, and we have already noted with the past examples. Even if we ignore them, there was a period of time where it was the Roker bishops that ordained some fake Orthodox bishops. Amongst them were people that believed that the Roman Catholic communion was legitimate until Vatican II and new calendars. So even their own.
I want to remind the audience one more time that earlier in the video, the people he's talking about that supposedly recognize the Roman Catholics and are these horrible fake Orthodox are the pre-revolutionary Russian and Greek churches.
Own succession is based off on these people who have no grace. The fake Orthodox also regard other fellow fakes with contempt. If you had two fake Orthodox arguing against you, saying that your church is graceless, the likelihood that the church they are in not recognizing the other is also very high. So even if they're on the same team, they're not really even on the same team. They're just on the same team and hating your church.
I think there are enough true Orthodox in our chats. I think there are enough true Orthodox that we talk to on a regular basis. And I think the fact that we do have living communions of true Orthodox bishops all over the world just makes David a liar here. But he could also just be ignorant. But if that hopefully will be corrected now, maybe he can do some research, which he won't.
Hating the Orthodox Church. And this is certainly not a surprise. When you think about it, it's the rigorous view is going to cause further schisms. When you apply the logical consequence of fake orthodoxy, you're going to be in schism with everyone else, and you're going to think, well, I'm the only one who has grace out of all of these people.
We've talked about St. Basil's shipwreck letter till we're blue in the face. This has always happened in times of heresy because usually the heretics take large positions of power and it takes a long time to resolve the issues. Of course, from David's perspective, the church should stay even if it's heretical, and actually it seems he seems to like the heretical sections more than the others.
And to the fake Orthodox, they might come up with an objection. They might look at this video and say, well, some of your examples aren't valid. Like when you talk about Nestorianism and Arianism, there weren't canons that condemned them at the time, right? When Saint Cyril condemned Nestorius with several anatomizations, the Council of Ephesus didn't depose him yet. Okay, so he can still be considered the Nestorianism wasn't uncanonical.
That's actually still wrong. We covered that in the beginning of this video. I hope you're starting to realize just precisely how deceptive this man's argument is. We've covered the separations that occurred during the Nestorian period. We've covered what the council did and how those form the backbone of Canon 15 of the First Second Synod, a live application of how the church does things. David's view is ahistorical and honestly a little deceptive.
So he's still technically a bishop.
And no, he's technically not.
You and I know that this argument is really bad because saying that presupposes that, for example, the canons are what gave Christ these things. Like, for example, Nicaea 1 is where Christ got his divinity. If you follow the logic.
If he really believes that Christ's divinity wasn't established until the First Council of Nicaea, there's very little to talk about.
Yet that is not true. As a matter of fact, we could even say that Christ's divinity was always dogma. It was always dogma, and believing otherwise was always a heresy. All right?
Yeah, that's true. That's correct.
And what canons do is that they tell you the dogma. They don't establish, they don't create a new dogma, if you try to get what I'm saying. And on that topic, heretics weren't the only people that believed in heresies. There were saints that had heretical views, like Saint Gregory of Nyssa, who believed in universalism. So
Saint Gregory of Nyssa supported the concept, but it's overextension to say that he was a real universalist.
Saint Gregory of Nyssa not a saint anymore because he had one heretical view? No.
Note that he's trying to preserve the idea that one can be Orthodox while having heretical views.
That's stupid.
Probably because his hierarchy is filled with heretical views.
The final objection will be that the rigorous view is not endorsed in the Bible. So, for example, in Numbers 15:32 to 36, we can see that the Sabbath is punishable by death. Yet Christ said that doing work on the Sabbath is permissible. So who is right here? Well, actually, both are correct. In Mark 2:33 to 28, Christ retells the story of King David breaking the canons by eating the bread that only Levites were supposed to eat. And also, despite the many problems the Pharisees had, Christ still held them as legitimate authority. He didn't schism from the Pharisees. He didn't tell anyone to schism from the Pharisees.
The Pharisees were a heretical sect, and the Jews were temple worshippers at the time. This is like Protestant level argumentation.
He says to Saint Fotini, who is the woman at the well, that salvation is of the Jews. In Matthew 23, he says the Pharisees sit on the mercy seat of Moses. And so when you look at overall church history, when you look at the canons, and when you look at the Bible, there's not a single thing that supports the fake Orthodox position.
And even though literally every single thing that he said was not only disprovable, it's disprovable from the rudder, disprovable from the history of the church, and we can source everything that we're saying, unlike David.
And I would like to conclude by telling something to those that are in the so-called true Orthodox Church.
Well, we're listening.
And this is something very important, all right? So when you say that our church has a problem, and you say that the Orthodox Church has an issue.
No, I didn't say that the Orthodox Church has an issue. I'm saying that innovators aren't part of the Orthodox Church.
You're not saying anything wrong. If you have noticed throughout this video, I did not try to defend Bartholomew's issues. I did not try to defend other patriarchs' problems.
You actually are indirectly defending them by demanding that people remain in communion with them.
But the question that we need to ask is this: since when did we not have problems? Look at church history. We always had issues. The church was
and the church solved those issues with councils.
Always full of issues, full of problems, and full of heretics within.
No, that part's wrong. Full of problems, sure. Full of heretics, but they didn't stay within. They leave the church.
And so breaking from the church and abandoning it is not going to solve these issues.
Okay. And the canon already covers that because, as we mentioned, in Canon 15 and in the previous canons of the Council of Ephesus, those who broke from heretical bodies are not leaving the church. They're preserving it.
Okay? You won't be saving the church by just running away and pretending everything is peachy in your own TO parish when it's even worse there.
Actually, that's exactly what we're doing, and that's why more and more people are coming to true Orthodox churches.
And you can also do the same in a real Orthodox parish, so what's even the point of schisming, right?
We know for a fact, even based on recent histories with people who have become true Orthodox, that that's a lie. There are people in World Orthodox parishes who are told not to even read the rudder. We've forced this issue, and it's becoming more visible. But no, this is not true at all. And a lot of people who have problems with World Orthodoxy are basically told to shut up or leave.
And so if you want to keep Holy Orthodoxy alive, you have to first come back home. And after that is done, you can talk about the problems of ecumenism. You can talk about all of that. I will 100% support you. Because as I said, there are problems in the church and they need solving. But the people...
If you don't believe that your metropolitan is a heretic when he's talking about ecumenism, then you would fall under the condemnation of Canon 15 of the First Second Synod because you would be causing a disturbance in the parish. So this is all just lies. It really is.
That want to solve it. If they run away, then the church is just going to get weaker. And so...
It's not the church anymore if they're preaching heresies. Find true bishops.
hopefully everyone that watched this video learned something new, and at the very least are convinced that this so-called true orthodoxy is not the way to go. And if you like this vid, just click like and subscribe if you want to see more content, because there's going to be more content coming next. And may the Holy Trinity bless you all. Thank you all for watching.
I didn't know he was a priest. But anyway, I am kind of glad that that's over, because quite frankly, I did learn something. I learned that David Erhan sits on a throne of law.